Pledge of Allegiance.
I would ask that we all take a moment of silence to observe however you choose. Thank you.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. There are no proclamations this evening, and so we will proceed with presentations. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This evening, we are going to have a legislative wrap-up session. It's going to be presented by Whitney Dameron, and I believe also his wife, who also partners with him on this account, Kathy Dameron. At this point, Mayor, with your permission, I'd ask Mr. Dameron to approach.
Mr. Dameron.
Thank you, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, members of the council, and staff. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Kathy and I do appreciate the opportunity to represent the city's interest before the state legislature and are happy to visit with you all about the session that just concluded, at least ceremonially, on Friday with adjournment sine die, and then Monday with the filing of candidate filings that concluded yesterday at noon. I think in your packet you have a memorandum dated June 3rd, which kind of highlights and references back to some information we provided to the city in a memorandum dated May 5th. I'll walk through those, and then there's been a lot of interest in the legislative process about the budget, and so Kathy's going to make some comments about the budget as well, and then both of us would be pleased to stand for questions at the appropriate time. As noted, the legislature concluded its business on May 30th and then came back for adjournment sine die, or concluded adjournment sine die on May 30th. At candidate filings that concluded yesterday, we only had a couple of the Shawnee County delegation who do not have races coming up this year, so a number of those will be going door to door soliciting funds and so forth. I believe Representative John Alcala and Representative Ron Highland do not have races in the primary or the general. Among the highlights of the issues that we were monitoring or involved with this session and the final disposition of those are listed on that memorandum. At the top of the list, the elimination of the mortgage registration fee. That was a big issue to municipalities. It was a big battle between Kansas Association of Bankers, Kansas Association of Realtors on one side, cities, counties, registers of deeds, et cetera, on the other. That debate became somewhat complicated in the process as proposals came forth to try to phase that out over a period of years. There was a proposal shopped to phase it out over 7 years. What ultimately passed is a phase out over 5 years and institute some fees. There will be some jurisdictions that are pretty significant losers in that process. Johnson County, Sedgwick County will be the biggest dollar-wise. It will be a hit to Shawnee County. Remains to be seen exactly how much that is. The opponent suggested that the increase in property valuations over a period of time could make up the lost revenues, but obviously that requires increasing the mill levy, increasing property taxes, and so forth. In the end, the cities and counties, the organizations, League of Kansas Municipalities, Kansas Association of Counties, took the position that they didn't want to compromise on the issue, and they were willing to take it to the legislature essentially for an up or down vote, and that's what happened when the votes weren't there to kill the bill, and so that's why we ended up with what we have, and something wasn't negotiated out over a longer period of time. Was legislation on expansion of TIF and CID proceeds. That wasn't necessarily something that was in the city's legislative agenda. It was something that we were paying attention to. There were changes to the regulation of firearms and preemption on local control. Investment of idle funds. There were changes to allow some different kinds of investment options for municipalities. The city was interested in that legislation. There was legislation to allow for the sale of the Landon and Eisenhower State Office buildings and the demolition of the Docking State Office building. Remains to be seen whether substantive proposals come forth on either of those two properties. I know the state does have an interest in demolishing the Docking State Office building. They've done pretty extensive studies and don't believe it's able to be retrofitted to the level that makes it a cost-effective remodeling proposition. What goes back there remains to be seen. Some have talked about a park. Probably not something that there's an interest in turning that into commercial property. I know earlier in the session, the city manager and I met with the Director of Facilities Management and the Secretary of Administration talking about the sale of state office buildings, and the city manager certainly can comment on that, but the city's position was and remains that if those buildings are sold, it was our interest to see employees stay in the downtown area. Secretary of Administration said that certainly was their intent and would be their requirement in any RFP that went forward. Timeline for docking that was stated back to us, if they have the money, which was in the budget, it would be a minimum of 31 months down the road before docking could come down, because they have to build a new power plant. They've got a site located about a block north of the state capitol that the state owns. And then there's already some efforts underway, I think, for moving people potentially out of docking into other buildings in downtown Topeka. The machinery and equipment legislation's been around for a couple of years. That was another one of those battles between the cities, counties on one side and certain interests on the other, such as the Kansas Chamber and some other big property tax payers. Proponents of that legislation were short of votes. Pushed very hard the last couple of years, but I think because it was unknown the total ramification of that bill, legislators were, at least a majority, were unwilling to pass something without knowing exactly what that shift potentially could be on residential small business property taxpayers. In the end, a compromise was put together that passed both the House and the Senate by unanimous votes. And probably not a perfect bill, but it did allow for an opportunity for certain complex pieces of real estate, whether it be the county or the property tax payer itself, to bring something forth to Property Valuation Division and get kind of an independent appraisal of that through a different process as opposed to what current process is. Legislation that failed to pass that we were involved with or paying attention to included the change in municipal elections, a very strong effort to do that, to move them from the spring to the fall. Kansas Republican Party testified, both the House and the Senate. They wanted to move them to even-numbered years. They wanted to make them partisan. In the end, there was not sufficient support to get that done, although probably up in the air of how close that would be. It was never voted on the floor of the House or the Senate, but the interest pushed very hard on that. City-county consolidation legislation did not advance. We did provide testimony on the Senate side on a bill that they'd had that carried over from the year before, that the city opposed the dual majority vote requirement in the consolidation legislation. Limitations were proposed on municipal lobbying. We've seen some in the past that would absolutely restrict it, would make it a criminal, put criminal penalties in place to use taxpayer funds to lobby the legislature. Those issues pretty much went away. There has been kind of where they've gone to now is some kind of a reporting mechanism for people like myself. If we have municipal contracts, that we have to file something with the Secretary of State's office on an annual basis, which I believe the press puts those kinds of things in the paper. I don't think it's a secret, but they wanted some kind of a single clearinghouse where people could go and probably put together a nice list of every city, county, and municipality that employs some kind of government relations representation in the State House. Limitations on utility franchise fees was introduced, had hearings in the Senate Committee on Utilities. Only applied really to a couple of instances, one being the city of Topeka and its franchise fee with Westar. That proposal would have capped the franchise fees at no more than 5%, and I believe there's one other city in the state that has a franchise fee over 5%. That bill did not come out of committee. There were proposals to once again make some substantive changes or limitations on unilateral annexation. Those did not advance. There was legislation on scrap metal theft, continues to be a problem in virtually all major municipalities. That issue was referred to the Judicial Council for study. We'll see if they can bring something back to the 2015 legislative session. Their charge is to evaluate what has been done in the past in Kansas, look at other states and see if there's some kind of a model for something that would improve that situation. Probably what improves that situation, quite frankly, is increased penalties and bed space. And it's very expensive when you bring those kinds of bills to the legislative process. Sentencing Commission comes over and says, if you do this, this is how many people will go to prison, this is what we have to pay for them, and the legislature ultimately says we can't afford to do that. So those are the challenges that we face. The alternative is increasing regulation and limitations on those who are in the metal business, and they object to that pretty strenuously as well. The one issue that we worked on, the city was interested in seeing passed, House Bill 2075. That was a neighborhood revitalization bill. I think, again, the major metropolitan cities struggle to find ways to deal with urban blight, to deal with problem neighborhood issues that tend to lower property taxes and create problems for all. Senate Committee on Local Government had hearings on the bill. In working with the chief sponsor of that legislation, Representative Fraunfelder from Kansas City, Kansas, and talking with leadership, felt there was possibly an opportunity to deal with that during the veto session. That did not happen. There were objections raised on the committee by the Senate president that what was being proposed would impact private property rights, and kind of laid down her objection to it, and the rest of the Republicans on the committee followed suit. In the last couple of weeks, the League of Kansas Municipalities has a new executive director on board who, before he'd left the state to take a position out of state, had lobbied for the city of Overland Park. I had a meeting with him last week and talked about some of the issues that the city of Topeka has continuing concerns with, and one of them being how to deal with those kinds of issues. I've also shared ideas with the city manager and suggested we might try to approach even some of the more conservative members of those committees on the House and the Senate side and talk to them about what the problem is for cities and try to get their buy-in on a solution. Try to bring some community people together that have some influence and can have a discussion with them. Because I think in the end, if you paint the picture and make the case that what they're doing is costing taxpayers money and they're being a burden on their communities, that there should be some opportunities to try to craft some legislation that can be targeted to what is truly happening in some of the urban areas, and hopefully we can move something forward in the process that doesn't have the same kind of objections we saw from the Senate president. Issues coming down the road, obviously elections. Kathy's going to talk about the budget issues that potentially could impact the T-Works program that is well underway after being adopted, the Comprehensive Transportation Program in 2010. That seems to be the annual bank of where the legislature goes when they run out of money. The governor has expressed his support for T-Works, so has the Secretary of Transportation. That doesn't always mean the legislature follows suit. Historically, we have interim studies when the legislature is out of session. They haven't done much of that in the last 3 or 4 years because of the budget. They have to pay people to come to town. They have to pay people to staff it. In election years, they also have other things to do with their door-to-door campaigns and so forth. So those are the kinds of things that we saw during the legislative session, what we see going forward. And with that, I might ask Kathy to come up and talk about the budget, and then certainly we'll respond to questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'll talk very briefly. I think next to their re-election campaigns, probably the issue that's causing the greatest anxiety at the State House, and certainly should for all of us who are in positions where we're looking at tax resources, is the shortfall in state collections. So just speaking briefly, the state's tax revenue estimators meet after April 15th and give an updated projection so that lawmakers might close out the year's budget in a way that's most informed. When they did that, they believed that everything was on sort of a steady course. Then 2 weeks later, when the April end of the month collections were tallied, we were $92 million short. So they explained it that it might well be a ramification of federal tax policy and maybe a 1 month only kind of anomaly. Unfortunately, Friday of last week, we found out it was not an anomaly, and in fact, the deficit was growing larger. The number of shortfall that was estimated to be received was $210 million for the month of May alone. So we're in a situation now where individual income taxes, which make up a large portion of the state's budget, are 54% below what they were a year ago. So if this delta continues to grow, I think we're all going to be facing some pretty tough decisions. If the state's budget gets too low, according to resources versus obligations, the executive branch will have to implement what are called allotments. And so they will go through before the legislature comes back in January and make cuts just according to those areas where they feel that they can make the most. We saw this last, I believe, in 2009, 2010, when the economic downturn really was taking its toll in the state. So we can hope that that won't be the case, but I do feel that it's our responsibility to make sure that folks who are here understand the gravity of the situation. And clearly, without any hesitation, I can assure you that regardless of who's elected in August and November, there will be a debate about tax policy in Kansas because the budget receipts are so much different than what the ongoing obligations are. So I would just encourage you, Mayor and Council and staff, to be thinking about the best way to engage for the citizens in the city as it relates to tax policy and the kinds of issues through the League of Municipalities and other organizations we might want to bring forward, because we'll have to ask for a seat at the table, and I think we'll get that, but there definitely will be an opportunity to debate. So, hate to end on such a down
Right.
note.
That's a happy note.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Perhaps
Thank
it'll
you.
make your issues seem
No,
small
makes-
by
makes our
comparison.
Matters minor. Thank you both very much, and now we're ready for questions. Councilman Harmon?
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you both for your testimony. What is the process by which the league formulates its legislative priorities and strategies for the 2015 session?
The league has meetings around the state. They are initiating that process now or in the next 30 days. And they have luncheons, coffees, et cetera, gatherings where they bring in local elected officials and they bring issues up into their committee process to consider, and then they put them forth. The league is pretty generic, pretty general in the kinds of things that they get into or what comes up through that process. And then when the legislative session comes about, they focus in on the big picture ideas, the mortgage registration issue, the M&E issue, and those things become priorities either for passage or defeat, tax lids and those kinds of things. In visiting with the league's new executive director, talked about some of the concerns that we have had, the way that process works and the kinds of issues that come up, and we see things that we get into that are of concern. And quite frankly, unless it is identified as a major concern of an individual city, historically what we see is their representatives, their government affairs representatives, it's not a priority for them in the legislative process. There are some exceptions, but they focus back on what their priorities are, and they defer to the league to carry the water on M&E, on mortgage registration issues. And I said, I think we have some cities in Kansas, and not trying to isolate or take away from the collective body of the league that represents some 600 cities, but there are probably a half a dozen that have state house retained representation and have issues of commonality that I felt it would be important if we could meet and discuss what the priorities are for, quite frankly, the major metropolitan cities going into the 2015 legislative session. It might be a better way for us to focus our energies on some things that are really important, that are specific in nature and not just general. Don't take away local control, don't take away our local taxing authority and things like that.
Right.
that is the process they go through.
Can I follow up,
Yes,
Your Honor?
Mr. Harmon.
Typically, we address our legislative priorities in the fall, which sounds like it's after the league has just done their work. Is that still an appropriate timeline, or should we get involved in the formulating our priorities sooner, so we can be part of the league's discussion, or is the way we're doing it satisfactory, in your opinion?
I think if there are specific issues that are of interest to the city, and one of the things that we've talked about is the urban blight issue, bringing that to the league and saying, we would like you to help focus a statewide discussion on that issue. That's very important to the city of Topeka. I think it'd be important to Wichita, Kansas City,
Right.
Kansas, and even becoming more so in Johnson County, and encouraging them to have that discussion. They do that in their timeline, we come up with some kind of a piece of legislation, it's still appropriate to consider for the city, whether it's before, during, or after that process. But I think if that is a continued priority for the city of Topeka, formally expressing our interest in having them consider that and being a part of that process now would be helpful.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. And I feel I should point out that I'm the mayor of the city of Topeka, sits on the governing board of the League of Municipalities. And this last year, I participated in the committee that dealt with determining the priorities for the league, and certainly encourage council members. The policies of the league are considered at the fall conference, which will be this year in October in Wichita. And certainly would encourage you to attend. That's when they have the open hearings, where by then, the committee has reviewed it during the summer. It is presented and changes are made in that session. So if council members could participate, it would be fantastic, because you really learn what other cities, what the issues are they're facing, and how we relate, and how we are similar and dissimilar in our views. Are there other questions or comments? Mrs. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Whitney, the Southeast Kansas got the state casino passed.
Yes.
Did that pass with flying colors, or whether? Okay. And my second question, follow-up to that is, did any of the cities down there testify to help that pass?
I don't recall. They had an economic development group that was created that came up and advanced that. When they had hearings on it, it was primarily carried by their senator from that area, and then their representative on the House side. It was put into a bill that essentially went over to the House for an up or down vote. You may have seen some of the commentary in the newspaper about that. The theory behind people advancing that was that they were going to make it a package bill to eliminate a revote on slots in Sedgwick County. And I don't think it's any surprise to anyone that this governor is not a fan of expanded gaming, and that was a difficult piece of legislation for him to sign. And when they brought it forth in 2013, those two issues were put together in the same bill, did not pass. So they split them out in two different bills, but their hope was to try to get both of them passed to the governor, and he would sign them both, say, I prohibited gaming in Wichita, a reconsideration, we have a reduced gaming opportunity in Southeast Kansas, and we're done. And, we probably still continue to see proposals for reducing the tax rate at slots and tracks. I don't see them passing. There are things contained in the Expanded Gaming Act and the contracts with the existing operators that effectively prohibit further expansion of gaming in the state, or it creates financial penalties, which are pretty extraordinary. So we're probably done with the gaming zones that have been created and where they've had expanded gaming.
They
authorized.
actually advocated it from an interesting perspective. I called this session sort of the Sadie Hawkins session, because what was up was down, what was black was white, in ways that I thought challenged people's creativity. In this case, they reduced the threshold of the initial investment for Southeast Kansas, which was how they were advocating that it was a reduction in gaming, even though it opens the door for a new casino. So And it became law without the governor's signature.
Other questions? Mrs. Hiller?
I have one for each, if I may. Whitney, if we could pull that discussion that you and Councilman Harmon had just a little farther. You've worked with the city of Topeka for a number of years, and certainly with that system at the state as well. And you know that typically, if we remember, or the council remembers, we work on our legislative agenda sometime around November. What would you recommend we should have as a calendar for how we start to look at issues and put together our agenda?
I think certainly any time is appropriate. I think in conjunction with what the league is doing as other cities and counties are starting to formulate their legislative agenda, but talking about some issues, whether it's in the committee process with the city council in August or September, would make sense. In regard to, like, again, back to the urban blight issue, it's somewhat complex in that every time you try to bring those things forward, we end up with this debate over personal property rights. If they want to let the grass get to a foot tall, you know, who are we to tell them they can't, or things like that, or cars in the front or the back, and et cetera, et cetera. But having a discussion and trying to bring in, I think, some legislators who historically have resisted those kinds of proposals in the fall between the primary and the general would make sense. Having that discussion with them and trying to put something that comes back before the council, getting some kind of an approval on an agenda in the month of November would be certainly helpful, so that we can communicate that to the legislative delegation, and then, of course, be prepared to discuss it when they have their meeting, which is typically in the first or second week of December.
So that would meet that what we've done before, but if I'm hearing correctly, we should really start looking at what some issues are that we would like to work in, let's say, July, and identify them in a preliminary agenda, if you will, in August, so that we can then get people working at that committee level and at the LKM level, and maybe then do a review and finalization for the session in November, but not start in October.
The more time that we have an opportunity to look at what has been proposed in the past, kind of compare and contrast earlier legislative proposals, if that has any influence on the discussion or the issue, look at perhaps what some other states have done, visit with the League of Municipalities or the Association of Counties or other interests. Yeah, the longer lead time we have, the better on that, to get something that's more fleshed out.
Thanks. I mean, it sounds like we shouldn't start before now because we need the wrap up of the last session, but that really should kick us into our look at first. Thank you. My question, Kathy, would be, and I know I've seen some news reports, but at this point, either from the news estimations or your own, with the deficit the way it is looking as of May, what do you see happening by the end of the year, and how would that affect Topeka?
Okay, it could
Dollars.
Right,
Yeah.
it could affect Topeka any number of ways,
Okay.
Councilwoman. And so if you look at all of the revenue streams that come from the state to the city, those would all be at risk if the projections continue on for the next several months. Where you would potentially have longer-term ramifications is if they, as policymakers, chose to curtail projects at KDOT, for instance, and shift money over into an entitlement area like Medicaid. So it's a domino effect in terms of how it could affect the city. Some of those will be unintended consequences. They won't be foreseen immediately. Some would be foreseen immediately. I can only tell you that the state is projected to have an ending balance of several $100 million, which people felt was adequate when they left here in early May. I don't know that anyone who's looking at the budget now would have that same sense of confidence that it will be enough to withstand action before the calendar year starts in January.
And that was simply based on income tax? You didn't really talk about sales tax or motor fuels tax? Or did I?
Right, this is overall, the tax collections are down for the state about 12%, but the biggest hit is the income tax, because that was where policymakers made the change 2 years ago. And so those income tax reductions are just now coming into play.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much. Appreciate
Thank
the
you.
update. And look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Mayor.
We will now proceed with the roll call.
Mayor Wolgast,
Here,
council members Hiller,
Here?
Ortiz. Here. Everhart. Here. De La Isla.
Here?
Manspeaker. Here. Schwartz. Here. Schmidt.
Here.
And Harmon.
and I now recognize the deputy mayor for special request.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would move to recess into executive session to discuss an attorney-client privileged matters that involves litigation. In addition to the governing body, I would ask that the city manager and the city's attorneys be present. It probably shouldn't take more than 15 minutes, so I'd make that motion.
Makes that motion. Mr. Harmon seconds. Is there discussion? All those in favor vote yes, opposed vote no.
We have 8 yes.
Having voted yes, we will go into an executive session. I'm sorry, folks, but you're going to have to take a brief recess and leave the room. And then when the room is complete, our executive session will begin. Thank you.
I don't like it.